All right. Welcome back to another lecture here. We're going to continue this discussion about westward expansion. We're going to call this part two. Okay. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a reflection here on where we've been in part one, if you look at some of these slides, in part one, we went over, sort of what did the North American continent look like as it was divided up among all of these superpowers. And then we went in and we talked a little about timelines and kind of where we've been here, going back to the American Revolution and some of the path forward that we have been taking. Going all the way to the start of our War of 1812, talking a little bit about the Monroe Doctrine, which we're going to talk about essentially in this part two episode. And then we're going to get in again further down the road into some other important topics like the Mexican-American War, and then eventually in this class, all the way into the Civil War, okay? We've also talked a little about expanding states' rights, land ordinances was a part of part one. We talked about expanding government power as well, and how that changed when we looked at Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion and how the Constitution becomes really an important factor of expanding government power now. We talked a little about in part one about what happens in the Jefferson presidency, right? What we call the age of Jefferson, this expansionist mentality. We looked at how there's the whole controversy behind the election of 1800 and how Adams will lose that election, right? And some of the controversy behind the Alien and Sedition Acts and things like that. We looked at and we talked a little about the Louisiana Purchase here, that mammoth-sized land purchase, right? 500 million plus acres for 15 million bucks, quite a bargain for its time. And then we talked a little about in part one about the War of 1812 and how Napoleon gives us a really good deal on, that chunk of land. Spent quite a bit of time the last couple of weeks taking a look at the Lewis and Clark expedition, the significance of that. Here's our War of 1812. And we had much discussion about some of the reasons why the war started. What were some of the reasons, such as impressment and a violation of American sovereignty, or this idea that America had independent rights to be a nation, to not pick sides in the war between Britain and France. And so what we want to do now is we want to jump into talking about expanding the presidency a little bit and our foreign affairs abroad, essentially, okay? So if we do that, we have to talk a little about President Monroe and something that's known as the Monroe Doctrine. And you can see a very simple definition here of how it describes what the Monroe Doctrine was. I like this image a lot because I think it does well to serve us in one slide, sort of the big ideas about what's happening here, okay? So if we go to 1823, there was actually a statement that was given by Monroe. I think it might have even been his State of the Union address, where he officially recognized that there was going to be some new countries that were going to be forming here in South America, like Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. These nations were sort of shedding their legacy of colonialism by the Spanish primarily, and to some extent the English, okay? And in order to sort of like let the world know America's sort of path forward when it came to foreign relations, essentially what Monroe declares is that there is going to be a line, essentially, drawn down the middle of the planet from north to south, dividing the world into two, what we call hemispheres, right? A hemisphere is essentially one half of the globe. And in this space, America would essentially protect its interests and protect new-born democracies that were forming in the Western Hemisphere, specifically in South America primarily, okay? And they essentially say, look, the struggle for democracy is a really important part of what America wants to protect. It has an interest in democracy because it is a democracy, obviously, right? And it wants to protect democracies because that is a reflection of the values of what America is, right? So, what is a doctrine? Well, a doctrine can be a lot of different things. One of the definitions that it could be is, a rule, basically. Here's a few guidelines, what we could call doctrine. You don't necessarily always think of these things as being doctrine, but let's say that we're going to school, like we're starting college. Some of the rules in our dorm, right, could be we got to keep food out of the dorm. We don't allow any sleeping bags in the dorms. You got to use sheets for hygiene reasons. Lights out at 11 p.m. in the dorm. You can't have lights out and have people up all hours of the night. You got to respect other people, right? This can be considered a doctrine. In the United States' consideration, their doctrine was simply their position on how they were going to be working with other nations moving forward, foreign relations with other countries. So it's a declaration to some extent of the rules of the game that America wants to play. And now those rules are European nations cannot colonize any nations in this Western hemisphere. The other part of this Western hemisphere would be all the way to like the islands in the Pacific, right? Sort of dividing the nation into two parts. It also says under Monroe that any nation that tries to colonize any of these areas in North America would be a direct attack on the United States. Okay. So again, it's declaring it's like drawing a line in the sand. This is our sandbox. This is your sandbox. Consequently, by them saying we don't want you to interfere in what's going on in this part of the world, the United States would stay out of anything that's going on over here, primarily in the development of Africa. There was a lot of colonization going on in Africa by European nations, and anything that was going on basically in Europe at that time. All right. So we see, a declaration, I guess you could say, of America's sort of interests and what it's willing to fight for eventually or claim. All right. So if we look at this from a simply sort of bullet point fashion, sort of a note fashion here. Let me get rid of this line that I've drawn down the center for you. If we're trying to figure out, okay, what do you want me to know, Mr. K? Like, what's the big issues here? President Monroe is going to declare in written form. That's really important. It's something that could be shared with others. That no European country is to interfere with U.S. affairs in the Western Hemisphere. No more colonizing of North America. Colonizing means what? Bringing your system of government, your people into a space, a geographic space, and setting up, essentially your own country's influence there. Obviously, England, if you think about colonizing, England was colonizing what we call the early colonies, right? As far back as the early 1600s. So America is a product of colonization. This strengthened our international policy around the world. We start to build up our military to some extent to protect our what we call sphere of influence, right? One of the vocabulary words that you have, I believe it's in assignment number 33, right, on the Monroe Doctrine. Other countries recognized that the U.S. was a growing power. And so this formal declaration is going to establish the United States as being recognized now as a world power. We're already by 1823 starting to expand our influence here in the North American continent, but now we're saying, look, we're going to protect the interests of fledgling, young, newborn democracies that are developing all along here in Central America and in South America. Now, consequently, what's happening? Europeans were trying to protect their interests in the continent of Africa primarily, but also in areas in Asia as well, and the Middle East. So they're expanding their spheres of influence out here. We're expanding our spheres of influence here. Again, part of this strategy is to protect our borders from outside influences, but it's also to start to push out a value system that we have as a nation. When you look at Assignment 33, it kind of gets into this a little bit more, and there's a very, very good, deeper explanation of Monroe's doctrine done by a woman who's linked in that assignment through Khan Academy, which I really like. So take a look at that if you want to get into the weeds a little bit more on this and understand in a little bit more detail. So that's expanding abroad. If you want to think of a theme, it's about westward expansion, but it's expanding now outside of our borders here, our influence. Let's talk a little bit about the expansion of a president's power. You know, if we've lived in currently now, we've experienced, as I reflect here a little bit in 2021, we had 4 years under a president by the name of Trump, who really also pushed the envelope when it came to presidential power and expanding the president's power. This subject matter is really a fascinating one, because if we think about presidents, the last 45 presidents, over the lifetime of America, every single president that's existed has constantly tried to expand their power within the executive branch of government. So they're constantly pushing the envelope, so to speak, about what they can do, as one person, as one part of the government. And so what we have to do is, I want to talk about a gentleman who becomes really popular as a product of the War of 1812 with the British. And his name was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is a very interesting character. He is very controversial in some ways, in the sense that either people really loved Andrew Jackson or they really hated him. He was sort of like, there really wasn't really anybody historically that we can go back and look at who said, that they were sort of in between and mixed about that. Andrew Jackson was considered to be an American hero of the War of 1812. He leads a ragtag group of militiamen from Tennessee. He comes all the way down, born in Tennessee, comes all the way down as a general of an army who raises a militia in Tennessee, walks that militia all the way down to the city of New Orleans in Louisiana to defend the city against the British. And he does so when he starts out with the blessing of Congress to do that, to come down and defend that port city, that's the mouth of the Mississippi River. When he gets there, he finds out that Congress has changed its mind, and they don't want him to actually defend the city. They want to give the city up, and they want him to return to Tennessee. Well, Andrew Jackson is quite the personality, and I will give you some more resources about him in the next week or two as we study westward expansion and the president's power. But he's a really strong personality, and he basically tells Congress that he's not going to leave. He's going to take that army, defend the city, and he does so even at his own expense. Even when the government is not willing to pay the militia and support them with supplies and money, he basically, out of his own pocket, will pay these men from Tennessee who are loyal followers of him, General Jackson's loyal followers, to defend the city. In a nutshell, he was essentially extremely outnumbered by British and Native Americans who were there to attack the city and get rid of Jackson and his forces. Ultimately, what happens is Jackson defends New Orleans in the Battle of New Orleans, and he defeats the British pretty badly and becomes an American icon, becomes a hero because of that. Ultimately, this is going to catapult him. It's going to catapult him into popularity in the United States, and he's going to become president, the 7th president of the United States. And he does some pretty extraordinary things. He's very nationalistic in his attitude. He's very much pro-America. The War of 1812 brings a lot of notoriety to him and brings a lot of sense of nationalism, that word that we've used in our previous assignment. This idea of nationalism, or a pride in America, America with a sense of purpose, America with a sense of values. And this is kind of going along, by the way, with Monroe's doctrine, right? How, Monroe pushes out this idea about a sphere of influence. So it's kind of all collectively going together here. Jackson, when he becomes president, is going to be considered a populist president. He's going to be considered a man of the people, right? Kind of like the same kind of attitude that he felt like Jefferson had, like he was a man of the people, except there was a huge gap between what Jackson did and what Jefferson did. Jackson sort of said, I'm the president, I'm going to do what I want. And if you don't like it, try to stop me because I have the loyalty of the military, I have the loyalty of the people, and all those upper crust New Englanders, right? Those wealthy bankers and businessmen, if they don't like it, well, that's too bad because they're all corrupt anyway, and they're all part of this system of government that's getting all out of hand. One of the things that he does was that he's going to close the National Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States. He's going to say it's not necessary. He's going to say the bank, all it's doing is leading to corruption, and it's destroying America and creating, the poor and the very, very wealthy. So he gets rid of it. Even when the Supreme Court tells him he doesn't have the right to do that, he says, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway. And the funny thing about this is nobody stops him from doing it. They never stop him. He closes the bank. And there's a whole more details about this that we can share together in class. That's one thing that he does. Another thing that he does is he's going to expand voting rights across the states. And what that means is he's going to make sure that voters get out and vote by getting people to become a lot more active in politics, increasing his influence over the people because people are supporting and voting for him. So this populist idea, this popular sort of idea of getting people out to vote, there's a lot of comparisons that people have made here between, Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump, to be honest. Some of this idea of his forceful personality and his use of the presidential sort of pen to create executive orders to make things happen. One of the things that Jackson's also pretty well known for is he was not a big friend of the Native American. In fact, one of the things that we're going to see him do is he's going to push a lot of Native Americans off their lands to the west, away from areas that were really desirable chunks of land for white settlement or white settlers. And he gets a reputation for this actually as being, not friendly to the Native American. Sort of like, they'll do what we tell them to do, or the consequence will be, bad things will happen to them. So his Indian removal policies, his using the military to forcefully remove Native Americans from land and put them on what we call reservations, becomes a caricature or a characteristic of his presidency. Another thing that he's really well known for is his use of what we call the spoils system. And basically what that means is friends who helped him get elected or who supported him as president or before president for that matter, he would give them positions in government like jobs. And the irony of this is a lot of the jobs that he gave to people that were his supporters through the spoils system, these people were not qualified for these jobs. He gave them positions within his cabinet, close advisor positions. He gave them positions like postmaster general and, a myriad of jobs where all these people really did was they sat at a desk and collected a paycheck. They really had no idea how to run that section of government that they were given the responsibility to run. And so, historically, there's going to be, and there already has been, a lot of comparisons between the activities that Andrew Jackson was doing and our 45th president, Donald Trump. Good or bad is to me sort of not relevant. It's just sort of there is academically even a lot of comparisons about how the power of the position of president was used by Jackson, and how Trump sort of in many ways mirrors a lot of that in some of the activities that he did. Um, he was considered, that is, as I mentioned earlier, he was considered a common man. Andrew Jackson was. There's some controversy about his marriage. There's some controversy about his adoption of an Indian boy on the battlefield. There's a lot of things that go into Andrew Jackson. Uh, but ultimately, he was considered a war hero, and he was, he was loved by the common people, those that were considered the rural farmer. Tennessee is a southern state. The people in the South really loved him. Northerners in the New England states were, especially among the business class, the upper wealthy, were not a big fan of Andrew Jackson because, in many ways, Jackson blamed them for a lot of the ills of America, a lot of the bad things that were going on. If we go back to the idea of, how he treats Native Americans, we have to mention something called the Indian Removal Act. Uh, it was an actual piece of legislation signed by Jackson and his supporters in Congress that is going to remove Native Americans that were along the Appalachian Mountains and in many cases, southern states like Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, move them out of their homeland area and put them on the western side of the Mississippi River. Okay. So one of the things that's kind of sad about this is a lot of Native Americans were very vocal at one point, and this is very much after Tecumseh's death in the War of 1812. We're talking the 1820s now and 1830s, where a lot of Native Americans had tried to adapt to the ways of the United States. They learned the English language in some cases. They adapted to try to become farmers, which was very foreign to many of their sort of cultural ways of life. They adopted a lot of customs that the Americans were forcing on them. Yet, what was Jackson's sort of position on this? And what was a populist position on this? It wasn't just Jackson's only, but a lot of Americans, a lot of white Americans supported the idea of removing Native Americans because the land was so valuable now, right? And Native Americans were sort of like in the way of what we would call American progress, expansion, getting into like building the farming and manufacturing and railroads and hunting areas and things like that. So Jackson is all about get out. And there are some white settlers, some white members of the legal profession actually that look at this and they say, wait a minute, you can't do that. These people have rights. And they're going to challenge this in court. They're going to challenge the Indian Removal Act. And ultimately, the court will say yes. The Supreme Court will say yes. These people have a right to be protected. They have a right to have their land, protected under the law. Yet Jackson says, I don't care what you say, Supreme Court. I'm going to do this anyway, and there's nothing that you can do about it. Because Congress, many of the people in Congress were not willing to go up against Jackson because a lot of the population, this nationalistic fervor, right, were very supportive of Jackson, and they didn't want to go against that. So ultimately, what ends up happening? Through the Indian Removal Act, we see in this map several different tribes who are removed, really, really far away from where they were originally from. All these lands, the Sac and the Fox, the Chickasaw tribes, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Creek tribes, the Seminole tribe all the way down here in Florida, they're all moved to the west into an area that we call today the Oklahoma Territory. Okay, this became a giant Indian reservation or land that was reserved, that's a reservation, for Native Americans to live on. Now, if you look at a map of the United States, and you can Google this on Google Maps if you want, take a look at what Oklahoma looks like. It is not heavily wooded. It is not, beautiful rushing rivers and, all kinds of game running around. Oklahoma is probably one of the most inhospitable pieces of land in the United States from from the idea of being able to sustain yourself, like live off of the land. It's pretty bleak. I'm not going to say it looks like the moon, but Oklahoma does not have the same kind of resources that the southern part of the United States has. So this land was sort of like given to them because nobody really wanted it, to be honest, and that's why they were put there. Again, Chief Justice John Marshall, he's going to rule in this case, Worcester versus Georgia. He's going to rule in favor of the Cherokee Indians and stated essentially that the states could not interfere with Indian nations, right? That they had sovereignty here. But Jackson says, I don't care what Chief Justice John Marshall says. He's made his decision, but let him try to enforce that decision. It's a challenge. And here we have the executive branch of the government essentially ignoring the judicial branch, ignoring it, and removing these Native Americans anyway. Okay, this becomes one of the most famous stories in Native American history. Becomes known as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears. During the winter, what are we going to see? We're going to see thousands of Native Americans be forced from their lands during the wintertime, and many of them walking, by the way. Thousands will die on this 800-mile journey from Georgia to the Indiana Territory. And this is the Indiana Territory right here, okay? So this will become later known as Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma. But they'll be forced to travel on this 800-mile journey. Thousands will die on the Trail of Tears. That's where it gets its name from. And many of them will die along the road and never actually be put in graves or buried in the formal Indian Native American ceremonies that were proper at that time. So there was a huge cultural demise and a huge cost to this action against Native populations. And to be honest, it's going to lead to, down the road in the 1870s and 80s, to a lot of other Native Americans out here in the unorganized territory reacting to that and resisting more formally the government's push of Native populations out, okay? So this kind of gives you the highlights of Jackson. Again, a lot of people down here in the South, they loved this guy, They loved what he was doing. They loved that he was putting their interests first, that nationalistic fervor. If you lived up here in the New England colonies or New England states, not colonies anymore, New England states, you're not a fan of his, okay? You're not liking him too much. You see what's happening here and you're trying to resist that. So that's kind of what I want to cover in this part 2, is these two big topics, this Monroe Doctrine topic and President Andrew Jackson. There will be another assignment that's going to follow up where I'm going to ask you to tell me, was Jackson's behaviors villainous or was he a hero? There's different approaches that people have taken on analyzing this president. And there's different arguments that you could have for both sides because, maybe closing the national bank was a good thing for the United States at the time. Maybe it did rid some of the corruption that was going on. He did expand voting rights. But there's, other issues too. The spoil system, visiting removal policies, and things like that. Okay? So I'll put this post up and use it as a reference along with the notes that are also available for you. Okay? Thank you for those that are watching these lectures and listening. And more to come later on. Thank you.